Hello and welcome back to the Hybrid Legal Loop. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about HR and people challenges for UK businesses. And I'm delighted to be joined by Sally Humphrey, who is our HR expert. Sally, welcome to the show.
Hi Ryan, nice to see you.
So Sally, thank you for joining us today. It would just be great for our listeners to hear a little bit more about your background and experience with HR and leading teams. So just tell us a bit more.
Yeah, sure. So for the last 25 plus years, I've worked in HR, and for the last 12 years working mainly with SMEs. Prior to that, I worked in a large global corporate organisation with clinical research where we worked with the pharmaceutical industry, and I had a global team of around 100 people. So worldwide, so it was a large role and gave me lots of different experience.
Wow, managing 100 people and being part of a leadership team there where you're responsible for HR, that sounds like it's probably got some amazing aspects to it, but also imagine quite high pressured as well. So actually that touches on an interesting point. When we say HR in a business, some people will roll their eyes and think, oh crikey, here's the fun police. But just tell me why that's not the case.
Well, I think at the end of the day, there's people issues in every business. And what we do in HR is we guide people through how to deal with those things. So especially in small, medium-sized companies where the business owners are passionate about what they do, but they don't necessarily have a lot of experience in terms of dealing with people issues. And they need support and guidance, and they need someone who can kind of hold their hand through some of those things. So we're not there to spoil the fun. We're not the fun police, but we do want to help people through their challenging times.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, for most businesses and most business owners that I've had the pleasure of working with over the years, their best and worst asset will be the team. In terms of best, if they've got some really good team members that are with them, worst in respects of when HR issues go wrong or when you have people challenges. Not only does it impact the leadership team, the employers, the shareholders, but it also impacts the wider team as well, doesn't it? And
Absolutely.
I think, that really leads me on to my key question for you, which will be, how can employers manage performance? And in particular, there was once upon a time this bit of phenomenon with quiet quitting. I remember quiet quitting was a thing on social media, where you had employees that were just silently, disengaging from their job, much less motivated, looking for jobs elsewhere. They checked out. How can employers grapple those challenges? Have you got any practical tips?
Yeah, sure. So I think the first thing is to understand, why is someone not performing? There's always a reason, and it might be that person's going through a particularly difficult point in their life. It might be that they're disengaged with the role that they're doing, or perhaps something has changed in the organisation. Perhaps their manager's changed. Perhaps they're not sure where the company's going. So the first thing I would say is take a step back. It can easily be very frustrating when someone's not performing. And the first thing that a business owner can think is, I just want this person to leave the organisation. But sometimes you actually just need to step back and think, why is this happening? Because it may be one person, but it may be several people. So the fact-finding piece and really talking to the person and understanding what's going on and asking them those outright questions is absolutely essential to finding out, what the reason is. And then you can start to unpick, okay, what can we do about that?
Sure. And that sounds like quite a difficult conversation to navigate. I know some employers will be often quite afraid to confront an employee, for want of a better word, to try and understand, well, not confront, but to have a tricky conversation around, what's going on at home or what's going on generally in the business. What aren't we getting right for you, or how can we be better as employers, or what can we do for you to help you perform a bit better? How do you navigate scenarios where that employee doesn't want to be open to the employer about the challenges that are causing, the performance issues?
Well, I think, the more people understand their employees, the better. So, we meet quite a lot of business owners sometimes who are extremely passionate about the day-to-day business. Perhaps they don't really know their team very well.
Yeah.
So I think getting to know them is really important, because then they're more likely to open up. But if they're very resistant and they still don't want to open up, you need to really make sure that you have a clear pattern for them in terms of what are you expecting from them? So what are they not delivering on? Have you got that well documented? Have you explained to them the repercussions if they don't perform? What's going to happen? And sometimes that's where we come in and we help and we support and guide, and we often coach business owners into having those conversations before they actually have it, so that they feel more comfortable with what they're doing. Because like you said, it can be nerve-wracking and uncomfortable, but that's my role, and that's what I do a lot of, is just talking people through how are they going to approach it, what they're going to say if the employee says this or if they say that, what's next.
Yeah, absolutely. And have you got any good examples where you've worked with an employer in the past where they've actually done that really well?
Yeah, I have a client actually in my mind who is in retail, and when I first got to know him, he was very, very, very passionate about his business and growing his business. But he didn't have the same passion for his team in terms of knowing them, knowing what made them tick. And so we actually sat and had some difficult conversations between us initially to say, well, what do you know about your team? What inspires them? What makes them, motivates them? What can we teach them? Where are their skills gaps, etc.? And he was like, well, I don't really know. So, let's just kind of get to the performance issue. And I said, well, maybe we need to just take a holistic view, step back, get to know them a bit better. And then actually maybe you'll find that some of them are in the wrong place in your business, and they could be much more valuable if they were doing what they really love doing. Yeah. So it's about people and their passion, but also sometimes it's because people just don't know what's expected.
Yeah.
And they're not really sure that they're not doing what they should be doing because no one's actually telling them that. And he was one of those people who we had some interesting conversations, but where we got to in the end is he now knows his team much better. They're focused, they're performing, they're delivering, they're productive, and he's getting everything he knows from them. But he's also recognising that with them. He's telling them when they've done a good job. He's rewarding people appropriately, which perhaps he wasn't doing to start with. And he's observing legislation, because ultimately there is laws in place and we need to follow them.
Yeah, no, that's really good. And I think if we now look at when things perhaps have turned a corner and you're now in a position where you need to dismiss an employee, what practical steps should an employer be thinking about before they go ahead and pull the trigger on dismissing that particular individual?
Yeah. So the first thing is people should always have written records of conversations that they've had with their team members. So right from the beginning, when you hire somebody, you have a probation period. That probation period is key. You need to be managing people through setting expectations, recording, having one-to-one discussions, whatever you want to call it, whether you want to formalise it, you need to record and document back if there's a problem. Equally, if it's doing something well, tell them that and make sure you do that. But if there is a problem, what is the problem? Have you documented it? Because often what happens is people come to me and they say, I want to get rid of X. He's not working out. And I say, okay, what conversations have you had with him? Is he aware that things have not been working out? Have you prepared mentally that person for the fact that the implication is that if you didn't do what you said you should do, there may be a chance that you're going to lose your job? And often the answer is no. And that obviously puts you in a very difficult position because that person is not expecting it. It's not a fair way to treat people and not the way we want to be treated as human beings. So ultimately it's about preparing the person and making sure that you've got everything well documented.
Yeah. And I mean, scenarios that I've seen play out time and time again will be where you have an employee that actually performs really well for the business, but they've lost the dressing room in respect of, they've just lost support from the rest of the team, or there seems to be, a bit of a clash internally with certain team members. And you're then in a position where, you need to make a decision to potentially get rid of somebody if it's that remedy of last resort. What's your experience with dealing with those scenarios where you've got, a bit of a conflict amongst team members, but yet the main person at the centre of that conflict is your best performer? How would you go about that?
It's tricky,
Yeah.
and I would be spending some time working with the team. I would try and get them to understand each other's personal working styles, so that they actually can appreciate that they are different, but they can all bring something to the table. Because actually, letting people go because there's conflicts is not usually the best outcome, particularly if they're your best performer. You want to keep everybody. Everybody brings something different.
Yeah.
And so it's about people appreciating each other. We don't have to be best friends to work well together, but we do need to respect each other. And there are certain boundaries that we can't step beyond.
Yeah.
So I think it's understanding those and getting your team members to understand those and try and work with each other.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
There's lots of things that you can use. There's lots of tools that you can use to give yourself insights into your own self and your own preferable styles, but also that of the others.
Yeah. And on the topic of tools, tell me more about HR software. Is there any HR software that you'd recommend? Because I know we do partner actually with a HR software provider, but just tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes, so there's lots of different products on the market, and I think it's about finding the right thing for you. As you say, we have a partner, and we'd be more than happy to speak to anyone who's interested about that particular partner and what they can offer. But ultimately, you want something that's simple, that you don't need to customize, and that can track your holiday, track your absence, can track performance conversations. The system that we partner with also has sort of timekeeping elements to it. It has recruitment modules. So there's lots of add-ons that you can also have. And it's about remembering that it's actually not that expensive. It's not as expensive as people often think. So I would encourage people to reach out to us and just ask us about it, because you might be surprised at what you can get for a very reasonable amount.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And how about employee survey software? I've seen that where, employers have sent out a survey where employees can engage with that survey and give their feedback anonymously on how the company in their eyes is performing.
Yes.
And it allows obviously employers the chance to respond directly to that without knowing who it is that's raised it. But I mean, what's your experience with those?
Again, it's a great thing to do, and we've actually done that for a number of clients where they've asked us as being impartial to run their survey for them. And we've done that for them. They've got some great data, and again, it can be done very inexpensively. So sometimes I think SMEs think that things are out of their price range, but if you come and talk to us, we can explain that actually they're not.
Yeah, and on the topic of costing the earth, obviously at the moment, as of the time of this recording, it is a tough time to be in business and to be an employer in particular, with the rise in national insurance contributions, and also the minimum wage has increased as well. And sadly, for quite a lot of employers, that has put some pressure on their balance sheets. And as a result, redundancy is now looking like one of the options. Now, I know that's a particular phrase that will send a shudder down quite a lot of people's backs, and it's a tough conversation to have. For anyone that's listening that has reached that point where they are considering redundancy as an option to try and keep the business trading, what would you say to them? Because is it really, because I've heard some employers say, well, can I just say that their job doesn't exist anymore? So just tell us, what to do in that scenario.
Yeah. So I had a client actually just last week who came to me and said, I think I'm going to have to make redundancies. We need to save some money. Business isn't as good as we were hoping. Some of the pipeline inquiries have not come through. What do you suggest? And basically we went through a number of different scenarios. So yes, of course, redundancies was an option, but we also talked through, maybe there's a temporary period where people would like to do some, coming up to the summertime, people might like to take a reduction in hours for a period of, say, 6 months. So actually what's happened is a number of people have taken a reduced hours. There's one person that's put themselves forward for voluntary redundancy, so we didn't have to go down a mandatory route, and without destabilising the whole workforce, we've managed to achieve the savings, the short-term savings that the business needed to achieve, and hopefully in 6 months' time, when everyone's back to their full hours, the business will be a bit more back on its feet and be able to support everybody. So that's a great example of where, yes, there was a need to think about it. it didn't actually need to happen in terms of mandatory redundancies, but we managed to work with the workforce to find solutions. So to a business that comes to me and says, can we not just say the role's no longer available? My answer would be no. If the role is genuinely not available, then that's one thing. But if you're trying to maneuver somebody out of a business and call it redundancy, you're going to lead yourself into problems. That will be either because you'll get a claim from the individual because it was an unfair dismissal, or you will get uncertainty from the rest of the workforce because you're basically saying that the business is possibly not viable going forward. So it's about using redundancy in the right way and following the right processes, because otherwise it can be extremely costly if you don't.
Yeah.
Reputationally as well as financially.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, it's so hard to find good people typically particularly as a smaller employer that perhaps doesn't have that brand establishment that the larger brands have. About attracting and retaining good people can be tough. So having to let them go as well, I imagine, it's even harder.
It's very tough. And ultimately, you shouldn't have in a business people who are you want to let go through redundancy. If someone's not performing, address the issue, tackle it, come to us, ask us for help. We can support you through those conversations, but don't let that fester, because what happens is the rest of the workforce get disgruntled because you're carrying non-performers. The person themselves is not happy because they're not performing, and there's a reason for that. So I would always encourage people to try and, tackle the difficult stuff.
Yeah.
Because it's much quicker and easier to do that than just let it fester.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because I think for me, the key takeaway there is if you need to have what you believe is a difficult conversation where you're really nervous as the manager, the leader, or the employer that needs to address that issue, but you're procrastinating and you're letting time pass by because you keep umming and ahhing about when to have that conversation, speak to your HR expert. Obviously, as you've noted, something that you're very capable of helping businesses with. But if anyone's listening that does, work with a HR expert, then don't be afraid to contact them, obviously, because that's the sort of thing that a good HR expert should be able to do.
Definitely.
Obviously, I think Sally's fabulous at doing that thing, but nevertheless, you can't all have Sally. But yeah, so I think, because that is much better than just ignoring it and allowing that to fester, and then it becomes an infection, doesn't it, in the business?
It does. And I think, in hybrid, that's where, that's why one of the reasons I love working with hybrid, because we work with clients every day, something different comes up. We get to know them personally. We know their business. So when they call us up and they say, do you remember when we talked about this the other day? Yes, we do remember. We don't need to go back over everything again. We know who you're talking about. We know what the issue is. And we just sort of walk them through and support them. And sometimes that means, me getting involved in having a conversation either with them, occasionally for them, but most of the time coaching them to have the conversation themselves.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And that leads me on to yet another example of a tricky conversation, and that is around employees that are unwell, that are off on long-term sick, for example, or where you see that there is a bit of a track record now for sick days. How do you balance, looking after the welfare of your team and doing the right thing as an employer when you've got team members that are unwell, against the needs of the business longer term and having, a fully functioning team? How do you walk that balance as an employer? What practical tips could you offer there?
Yeah. So it's difficult. And again, when you're a small business and you have, one or two people out, that can be a huge impact, puts other people under pressure. It's the same thing as before in terms of recording and documenting is key. So when somebody is off sick, making sure that you're recording it, either whichever way you record it. If you have an HR system, that's obviously great because it's visible to the individual, but it's also trackable. And you do need to track absence. It's one of the data points that's essential to track, because you need to see if there's a picture and there's a pattern. It may be that you've got somebody who's always off on a Monday or a Friday, and there's a pattern there of short-term absences. So if you're tracking, then you can have a really detailed conversation and say, here's your sickness record, this is what I'm seeing, let's talk about that, what's happening, and it's very evident. The trickier points around absence and sickness absence are around long term and people with disabilities. And we have to accept everybody does get ill. That's life. It's genuine a lot of the time. And, a lot of people are not doing it to be difficult. So we need to understand what sorts of challenges people have with their health, talk to them about it. Again, it's having the difficult conversation. But if someone's off sick, don't just leave them off sick. Keep in touch with them, find out how they're doing, get them to be accountable in terms of reporting in, phoning in and talking to their manager, telling them when they're expecting to be back. So it's about, really talking to them and keeping them engaged during that period.
Yeah. And another question that I've thought of around businesses that are going through change, and that is, there's businesses that are merging together to try and get through the current market conditions, or there are businesses that are selling, because the owners have got to a stage where selling the business is now the best choice for them. But of course, they're leaving a team behind for new ownership to inherit. Is it just a case of, if the new owners want to, delayer or get rid of staff, that's nice and easy? Or actually, is there a challenge there? Is there things that people that are going through a transaction at the moment need to be aware of when it comes to the team?
Yes. So if you're selling a business and it's transferring under TUPE, the transfer of undertakings, then the employees are protected. And so, for example, in that scenario, you don't have a choice. Those people will transfer over to you as the new owners. So say it's a service provision change, for example. Let's just take a very simple, it's a cleaning company. And the cleaning company, the contract is going from one cleaning company to a new cleaning company. The staff will go with that contract. So the new company don't have a choice. They inherit those staff and then they need to manage them appropriately. So if they then have too many people and they need to reduce down, they would obviously go through a redundancy process.
Sure.
But it does depend a little bit on the way that the company is being sold. So whether it's a share sale or there's different scenarios. So we would have to advise on that particular instance.
Of course.
But ultimately you inherit the people that you buy the business.
Yeah, I mean, I have heard of examples. I can remember one vivid example of a garden centre a good few years ago, and the new owners, they purchased the garden centre and they found out a few months later that they had a couple of landscapers that were on probably double the going rate in the market. And when they started doing some due diligence on these particular individuals, they worked out that they were connected to the old owners. And the old owners, I think 4 months prior to the sale, had boosted up their salary. So that was obviously a challenge. So it can obviously be misused, sadly, as well.
Absolutely. But I think that speaks to the importance of due diligence.
Yeah.
If you're buying a business, then you absolutely need to do your due diligence before you make your purchase. And that comes to the staff as well. You want to understand there's certain things that we would always ask about the staff, and understanding, what they're paid, their terms, etc. And having, really good contracts in place. Sometimes HR can, there's boring elements to HR, which are getting the basics in place. And if you don't get those in place, they can come back to haunt you later. So having good policies, having good contracts, having recording of data, like we've just been speaking about, all those things are just the essentials to business. And they're as important as having good terms and conditions of employment and business terms and conditions.
Yeah. And what's your view on AI? Because obviously I'm certainly seeing, a lot of potential clients come to us with AI generated contracts. But I imagine you're starting to see quite a lot of AI generated documents and policies.
Yes.
Does it work? Doesn't it work? What should people be thinking about?
I think with AI, it's got its place, like everything. At the end of the day, it's there are times when it can be incredibly helpful and useful, and it can speed things up for us. I get quite a lot these days of responses from employees that are clearly AI generated. So it's not them responding. I've had grievances that have clearly been written by AI. And I think you handle everything as you would do normally. You deal with it professionally. You go through the facts, you go through your investigations if that's what you're doing. So I think AI has its place
Yeah, I think my personal observation and a challenge that I see with AI, and look, I think there's lots of opportunity with AI, but I think a fundamental challenge, as you've just noted there, you have people that are using AI to prepare their grievances or to help them think about what they're going to say to their employer or their employee. But I think what that's taking away is the actual true human element of having that conversation, because at the end of the day, most businesses will work in person with somebody. And I think those in-person interactions, the body language, the eye contacts, and just generally having those type of conversations, if you rely on AI, you're not going to be well practiced in the actual physical communications,
Yeah.
which I think quite a lot of businesses still need. I know there are some businesses out there that don't need that anymore, and fair enough, that's their business model. But I think for other businesses that really do need that human interaction, I would tread with caution, use it in certain cases, but don't overly rely on it. And that's my worry. I think people are starting to overly rely on AI.
And I think what I see is if I get an AI generated grievance, for example, and then I conduct the investigation and I start asking the person about their grievance, which they've put in writing, you can quickly see that they haven't put it together themselves because they're not familiar with the data and the facts that they're including.
Yeah.
And, I think that's where it becomes quite dangerous.
Yeah.
So I would encourage people to really note down the facts in their own words, because it's certainly more powerful and it's easier to resolve the issue.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so my next question, what is one of the biggest myths that you can dispel when it comes to HR and employment? What's a big myth?
So I think the one that I always hear is that I can dismiss somebody with less than 2 years service and there's no risk. And the answer is there is always a risk when you terminate employment. And so you need to consider what your risks are. So, for example, an employee can make a claim from day one. If they have discriminatory reasons, they can make a claim. So people think that the 2-year rule is a kind of get out, that they can let people go and there's no comeback to it. But actually that's not the case. Also, people need to be aware of the fact that they may have a contract of employment that has a contractual disciplinary procedure in it. And often I speak to people and ask them that question and they don't know because they're not sure and they haven't read their contracts of employment for a very long time, or they haven't been updated for a long time. So what I would say to people is don't be swayed by that myth, because actually you need to look at every situation in its own merit. And certainly if you're not sure, get advice. Don't terminate someone's employment without getting the right advice.
Sure. And we have obviously going through, as of the time of this recording, some new employment legislation that's been proposed. Just give us a quick idea of, obviously we don't need to go through all of the legislation, but some of the key headline points that are going to impact employers listening.
Yes, and I'm sure a lot of the listeners will have heard and seen, there's been a lot in the press about this recently. So the employment bill is being updated. And one of the big changes is that every employee is going to get day one rights. So whereas the 2-year myth, it's not a myth, it is real, but actually there is a risk to it. So going forward from day one, every employee will have full employment rights, so which means they can claim unfair dismissal from day one. And so employers are rightly going to be nervous about that, which brings back to the probation period and why it's so important to use probation correctly and actually monitor and measure someone's performance as they're going through that early part of joining you. Because it may be they're not the right fit, but it may be they are the right fit, but they just need to adapt the way they're working or learn some new skills. The current thinking is that there will be an initial period of employment, which will be 9 months, set by the government. And during that period, you will be monitoring the individual. And if you want to let them go, end their employment, there will be a process that you will have to follow. Whereas at the moment, it's more straightforward.
Sure. Yeah, and how do you see the day one rights that have been proposed impacting recruitment?
I think people will be more cautious about the number of people they're recruiting and their recruitment process, which is not necessarily a bad thing, because I think people need to put more effort into their recruitment anyway and spend more time. Maybe they'll have more interview stages. People will come in and meet a broader members of the team. There'll be more in-depth interviews, but I think ultimately that initial period will be key, and hopefully it will give people more focus on really managing people's performance right from day one.
Yeah, brilliant. Sally, thank you very much. That's been really helpful. And thank you for listening to the Hybrid Legal Loop. If you'd like to, watch this episode or engage with us, you can find us on YouTube, on Spotify, and also please feel free to get in touch with us via the link below if you would like to speak to Sally about any of your people challenges or HR opportunities, perhaps. We'll be delighted to help you, and I know Sally will be delighted as well. So thank you for listening.